Mac Power Users, episode 538. I predate the home computer with James Thomson. Hello and welcome back to Mac Power Users. My name is Stephen Hackett. I'm joined as always by my friend and yours, Mr. David Sparks.
Hello, Stephen. I'm excited for today's show. Got an interesting guest.
We do. It's going to be so much fun. I was looking back through the archives. We're planning guests, and I was like, wait, this person hasn't been on. We should fix this. And so we are joined by the friend of the internet. I think I'm going to give him that title, Mr. James Thomson.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was looking at it, it's like, yeah, it has taken 538 episodes for you to notice, but I'm here now.
I feel really bad. I just want you to know that.
I'm joking. That sounds like I've got a massive ego. Well, I do have a massive ego.
But the funny thing is we've talked about you on the show. I mean, back the shows I did with Katie, we used to talk about you. I don't know. Maybe we just felt like you were inaccessible. You were like one of those people at the top with like 2 or 3 assistants, and we'd never get through to you.
I think I could not be further from the truth.
Well, James is the developer of PCalc, and you've done a lot of stuff with Apple and as an independent developer over the years. And James, I'm really looking forward to talking to you today about some of your experiences.
Well, hopefully I've got something interesting to say about them.
Oh, I know you do. The question is, will we get you to say it?
Look, I left Apple 20 years ago. I feel like the statute of limitations is passed on anything. So
I like that.
Me too.
I like that.
So, James, I feel like we've known each other a long time. We have a shared interest in technology history. We have a shared interest in Lego. We have a shared interest in nerdy things for nerdy things' sake. I feel like we are just very much cut from the same cloth. But we want our listeners to get to know you a little bit. So give us a little bit of your background and maybe how you made it to be the full-time developer that you are now.
I mean, I guess the sort of where to start is right at the beginning. I mean, it's like I'm old enough that I sort of predate the home computer. And my first sort of real computer experiences were, I had a next door neighbor who was American from California. And he had an Apple II. And this would probably be very early 80s, probably 80, 81 or something. And I would go around there and I would play on the Apple II. And I would play all these, like there was a game that took me about 10 years to work out what it actually was, but it was a game called Mask of the Sun. And it was a sort of text adventure, of the sort of go north pickup thing type. And that was really sort of my formative computer experience. But then in 83, I got my own home computer, which was a Commodore 64. And in the UK, there were 2 rivals. There was the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. There were really other computers, but they didn't count. It was those 2. And I chose the Commodore 64, not really knowing anything between like British and American or anything. But I chose the Commodore 64 because it seemed to have a slightly better version of Pac-Man. I mean, this was like at the height of Pac-Man fever.
Yeah.
And I think I actually made the right choice because the Commodore had really nice graphics and sound. I mean, really nice graphics and sound for 1983. But it did have this thing called CompuNet, which was a UK-only sort of proprietary AOL-like online service. This was around 85 or something. And it had MUDs, which are multi-user dungeons, so basically multiplayer text adventures.
Yep.
And it had software uploads and downloads, and there was a sort of demo scene around it. And there were a lot of game developers that I'd become aware of. It took me a while to work out that all these things are actually created by people. And there was one developer called Jeff Mentor who wrote all these games in the UK and is still writing games. And he's the reason, basically, that I learned to code because I wanted to write games like he wrote. And that was kind of like the start. And then things rolled out over time, and it was like that our school was the first school in Scotland to get a computer, like one computer.
Yeah.
And this was in 1983. And this was an Acorn BBC Model B computer, another British specialty. And when it arrived in the school, the teachers had no idea what to do with it because none of them, I think, had used a computer. So they put out a call to the students and said, and this was, I would be probably, 83. I'd be about 10 at the time. And they said, does anyone have a computer and knows anything to do with this thing? And there were 4 of us that put up our hand and said, yes, we are clearly the experts here. So we were brought in and we ended up teaching the teachers how to use this computer and then teaching some of the kids in the lower years before school started. We had these like computer lessons that we ran, and we actually ended up having an office, like the 4 of us. And
nice.
we were like school kids and we had an office in the school. Nice. And we would sit in there and we would learn to program and we would listen to music and we would play video games. And that was pretty much the entirety of my last primary school year, this primary 7. I know it's all different to your terms, but it was basically the 7th year of my school.
Well, back then it was interesting because people wanted to play games. I mean, I'm kind of the same generation as you, and it was command line computers. Commodore 64 was also in the United States. It was a great computer, but we didn't have a lot to work with. And also game developers really didn't have a lot to work with. So it was really kind of fun to see the different kinds of games that came out. And the one genre you keep talking about that you really don't see anymore is kind of the text adventure. But that was something that was accessible to us,
Yeah, and we wrote a text adventure ourselves. It was the first thing I really wrote as a program.
Yeah, me too. Everybody did that. If yes, go to 20. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, we were self-teaching ourselves how to write this thing, and it was the schools were having a competition between all the different schools in the area, and we had to produce a sort of multimedia pack, and multimedia in the sense of like writing, drawings, whatever. And our group said, we're going to write like a program to go into this pack because, we're cool. And we wrote this text adventure, and it was all based on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So it was a sort of, it wasn't great. It was probably, a limited number of locations and things you could do. There were some graphics and things as well. But we wrote this thing and our school won the competition. And we were like, well, clearly this was our game had pushed us over the edge to win this. And at the prize-giving ceremony, the guy who was running the competition, who worked for the libraries, he said there was also this tape in with the pack, and I put it in my stereo, and it was just a bunch of high-pitched noises. I don't know what that was. So yeah,
yeah. So for the younger listeners, you used to use cassette tapes to record your programs too before there were discs.
Yeah, and so I went through all the sort of the various upgrades, and I got a Commodore 128, and eventually I got myself an Atari computer because I was really into music and I was going to be this big shot musician, and the Atari had all these MIDI ports. And I recently found the last trip we made before lockdown was to take stuff to the dump, and went to the dump and unloaded all this stuff, and there was a bunch of dead electronics and things like that. Mm-hmm. And as I was turning to leave, I could see a keyboard sticking out of a cardboard box. And I looked and I thought, oh, I wonder what kind of keyboard this is. And then I looked at it further and I realized that it was the keyboard of an Atari STE, which was the computer that I had back then.
Wow.
And I lifted it up, and underneath the Atari 520, there was an Amiga 500. And both of these with like power supplies and mice and everything. And I was like, well, I can't really leave this stuff here.
Mm-mm. No, you can't.
And so you're not allowed to take stuff from the dumps here. There's rules about that kind of thing. So I'm sort of carrying this, lots of computer parts. And a guy comes up to me and he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, these are vintage. I can't leave them. And he's like, go on then. So I have the two behind me, and the Atari. I plugged it all in, and I still have one old TV. It's a flat screen, but it still had an RF in, and I plugged the Atari into it, and it had a Tetris floppy disk in it, and it booted up fine and works perfectly. The Amiga doesn't boot, and I think it's a dead power supply. But I just bought a replacement floppy drive emulator. So it's a little box that fits a standard floppy drive of the time, but it's got a slot on the front for a USB stick and a sort of up-down. So you can load it up with like 1,000 virtual floppy disks and then pick which one you want it to be. Apparently these are generally for like musical instruments, and there's all sorts of weird things that used floppy drives that they still want to work.
Yeah.
But yeah, I plan to kind of get these two things going again. And, it's a sickness. I realize that.
I spent a significant portion of my childhood on an Atari ST, and I specifically remember when the 520 STE came out, how jealous I was of everybody that got that computer, because I had the older one.
Yeah.
And then at one point, I had taken my computer to a friend, and we literally soldered RAM on top of the RAM. Mm-hmm. We just opened it up, and we got a bunch of RAM out of the back of a magazine, I think. And you just soldered every pin on top of the other pin, and I doubled the memory, and I thought I was just amazing,
Yeah. I mean, you didn't actually miss much because there was very little software that was written that took advantage of the STE bits. It was like the Commodore 128. The only thing I ever ran on that really was Commodore 64 software, and occasionally there'd be some game that would run at twice the frame rate or something like that. But
yeah, I think the STE was kind of the end of the Atari run. That was when they were kind of falling off. But the just for fun, a few years ago, I stumbled into some Atari ST software that you could run on the Mac to just kind of emulate it. And it was really kind of fun seeing the little busy bee icon and the stuff that in high school was such a big deal to me.
Oh, I mean, that was the thing that I discovered because when I went to university, I did a computing science degree from 1990 to 94. And the university was all Macs, or at least the computing science department was all Macs. The rest of the university was PCs, but the computing science at the time, at least, was fairly sensible about these things. And using a Mac for the first time, it was the sort of the realization that the ST's GEM user interface was just a ripoff of
total ripoff
of the Mac, and it was like going from this second-rate clone. Sorry, yes. Atari fans, and finding what seeing what it had all been come from, and so one of my favorite courses that we did at university was a user interface design course, and what they did was they would spend an entire lesson going through one small facet of the Mac UI and explaining what choices had been made, why would they have done things this way? And, so spending multiple hours on an open dialogue and why does the open dialogue, open save dialogue work like this? Why would you do it this way rather than this way? And that was my favorite course. And that's still why my favorite thing is user interface design.
That seems like a very forward-thinking program, back in the early days of computing.
Yeah, I mean, strangely enough, I don't think of 1990 as the early days of computing, even though technically it might be 30 years ago. It feels like not a lot has changed, even though an awful lot has changed. But, the stuff that I learned then about, user testing and all that sort of stuff still 100% applies right now. And, the user interface of a Mac is not that different to the user interface of a Mac 30 years ago.
No.
I mean, I guess by 1990, the Mac had been out 6 years, but that's kind of the starting to the turn of they really were showing up in way more households, way more schools, right? It was becoming a deal where the computer just wasn't for some people, but almost anybody in an office was going to be doing stuff on a computer, right? Preparing you for the real world that you're going to experience once you were out of school.
Yeah, and around then was I started on System 6, but System 7 came out, and that was really big deal. I remember sort of downloading copies of that from Apple And my first Mac was a Mac Classic that I bought around 1991. I sold the Atari and all my synthesizers, and I bought this Mac Classic. And I say it was, this huge loss to the music industry that I retired at that point. But, I bought the Mac Classic because we were doing, all our development on Macs, and we were using Turbo Pascal and Think Pascal at the time. So being able to do it from the house was, it meant I didn't have to hang around in the labs all the time. And also at the time, the educational discount was extremely significant on Macs. I think it was greater than 50% is my guess. So, I bought a pretty high spec for the time Mac Classic. It was the 4 meg of RAM, 40 meg hard disk, and that was my main machine for quite a while, and that's where I started writing PCalc.
So you're the developer of PCalc. You worked on PCalc starting back in, what was it, 92?
Yeah, I can't remember the exact time I started, but it released in December 92, so I think I must have started it in summer of 92.
Yeah. And before we move on, just one point about what Stephen was saying earlier is you really had to be there. The change from the command line to the graphical user interface, it really changed everything. I guess you could argue that the change from graphical user interface to the touch interface of the iPhone was a bigger deal. But looking back on my life, I think that the change from command line to graphical user interface made computers from the thing that 4 people in the whole school knew about to something that everybody used. It really made computers a thing when the GUI came out.
Yeah, and the other thing about these times is this is pre-web, which is kind of a weird thing. I was reading Usenet, and Tidbits was, I would get that through, Usenet posts and email and things like that. So there was not the same kind of infrastructure, and software was typically distributed via FTP sites and things like that. It feels in some ways like today, but also there's just so much has changed. Yeah, it's recognizable and unrecognizable.
I mean, you were talking about how the Mac's UI is relatively the same, right? If you sort of back up from the desk and take your glasses off, it's it all kind of works the same way. And I think some people would say, well, maybe desktop computers have slowed down and the future is other platforms, and some of that could be true, but I think it's true also what a testament that early work that was put in, how good that work was, right? And how you can have something that is now decades old, the concepts are decades old, but it's still relevant today.
Yeah, and I remember at the time the sort of using the Mac properly for the first time, and the just the sense of this is something special. This is different to everything I've used before, and that's a kind of feeling that I've only had once since then, which was the first time I used an iPhone. And both of those, I think, are sort of really key moments in kind of nailing a user interface. And I mean, the iPhone nailed it probably even more because, it just landed and it worked and everything was there. And the Mac, took a while to get to the stage when I first knew it. It's been interesting to be present at both of those events.
Yeah, and it is kind of like the eureka moment. Like you, James, I spent a lot of time with fringe computers, Commodores, Ataris, and because the Mac was inaccessible to me, it was just too expensive,
Yeah, that was the thing. I only got a Mac because I worked a long summer job and put all of my money. Well, I put all of my money first into the ST and then I sold all of that and put it into the Mac. But yeah, I mean, it was not. I mean, even the Commodore 64s, they were very expensive for the time. I mean, they're multiple hundreds of pounds in the 80s, which was probably thousands of pounds now. Don't look up my math. I'm not actually sure that's true, but yeah.
You could do it with PCalc, I'm sure.
I'll need to put in a historical pricing currency conversions.
Well, you've got the Hackett constant. You should have the Mac constant, which is the price of the original Macintosh.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, but for me, I got to college and they had Macs in the computer lab, and that was it. I just started sleeping at the computer lab because I refused to go work on that crappy Atari computer when I had the real thing at school. So it totally changed for me. Yeah, I get it, man.
Yeah,
I'm with
and
you.
when I graduated in '94, I was looking around to get a job, and I think it was a lot easier for software engineering graduates to get work back then. And one of the companies that was really heavily looking for Mac programmers was Tetra Pak, who make the sort of like milk cartons and orange cartons and things, because they were a company who uniquely and strangely ran their factory production machinery with Macs. And this is not a very common thing to my knowledge. So they were looking for Mac programmers basically to maintain the software that ran the production lines. And I applied for a job there, and I got through to the second round of interviews. And a friend of mine from the same department, he was like a week ahead of me in the interviews. He got a job. And so I was kind of pretty sure I was going to get a job. And then they worked out that they actually had no money, and nobody got jobs. And I think they laid people off. But my friend got some severance package because he had been like employed for a day or something. And I got nothing. And while I was at the university, I was a student representative. So the kind of person that went to the meetings with the staff and put forward the students' position on various things. And I would always be in there complaining about the way the servers were run. And so we had all these servers that had software on them for the Macs. And, I would complain about stuff. And my punishment for the complaining was I was given the job of actually maintaining those servers. So I then had the students complaining at me about the way I was running things. But I was a sysadmin, and I looked after some of the Mac labs and some of the Unix machines for another 2 years after that point.
That's probably great knowledge, though, working on all those Macs during that time.
Yeah. I mean, it was like I was writing sort of lab software by day and, teaching myself more about how to program the Mac and, working on my own stuff in the evenings at home, things like that. So it was kind of like a boot camp in, learning how to do this stuff. And also, being a Unix system administrator turns out was actually quite useful for running a Mac however many years later.
All right, then where'd you go after that?
So I feel I dine out a bit too much on these stories because I was only at Apple for less than 4 years. I joined late 96 and I left early 2000. But I think those years are kind of some of the most interesting years at Apple because, I arrived at Apple. And I should say, the reason that I got a job at Apple was I put in the documentation of both PCalc and DragThing, which we haven't mentioned, which is was my application doc. And I put in the documentation that I wanted to work for Apple. And eventually somebody read that and reached out to me and said, do you want to come for an interview?
Really?
And this was at Apple in Cork in the south of Ireland. They had a small development group there who worked on, not necessarily the top tier of things, but it was a group of about 50 engineers and 200 testers that were working on stuff. Cork was mainly a manufacturing plant. Like they made everything, I think, from Apple IIs through to iMacs and things there. I think at the start they actually did all the PCBs as well, so it was kind of sand went in one end of the factory and computers came out the other. But there was this small group that was attached to it. And it was nice because it was within Europe, so it wasn't like a moving to Cupertino type of deal. I went over and I had an interview and I got the job. But when I arrived at Apple, I had just had this romantic notion in my head of wanting to work for Apple because I'd been since I used that Mac for the first time in 1990, I'd become the biggest Apple fanboy. And so I wanted to work for Apple, of course. And then when I arrived, it was Copeland, the next generation OS, the Mac OS 8 that never was in the process of being cancelled. There was a lot of layoffs happening. And Apple was actually close to bankruptcy. And I had no idea about any of this. And my manager who hired me left like a few months after I arrived, and nobody replaced him. And it was a really strange time. And I'm blanking on his name. Gil Emilio, yes, was brought in to sort of right the ship, famously as a hatchet man. And there was a very severe package of layoffs started happening. And when people also left for other reasons, they just weren't replaced. So, the episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation when Beverly Crusher is on the Enterprise and people start disappearing.
Yes.
And then like gradually it's like just a handful of people and then it's just her. So that was pretty much how it felt at the time.
So you were in an Apple warp bubble, is what you're telling us.
And I worked on the Copeland installer for 2 weeks. Copeland had been cancelled, I think, at this point, but people were still working on it. People like refused to believe that it had, because people have been working on this thing for years. Mm-hmm. And so there was a kind of like, well, they're not really serious about it, because we've put too much effort into this. And Copeland was it was the preemptive multitasking replacement for macOS, but based on macOS. And nobody could comprehend the fact that, all this work would be thrown away. So I was on the installer for a couple of weeks, and some of that work, probably not my work, ended up in the Mac OS 8, other Mac OS 8 installer, because they looked fairly similar. And it was just the sort of the feeling of being on, a company that is probably going to go out of business, mm-hmm. and then everything changing at such a rapid rate. Like I worked on two projects. My first two projects were actually worked for Disney because Apple wanted software for the performers that were coming out. And the way I tell the story, which is kind of mostly made up, but it's that Apple went to Disney and said, we would like you to port your print studio products to the Mac and we'll give you like $1 million. And Disney comes to Apple in Ireland and says, we'd like you to port these print studios to the Mac and we'll give you $500,000. But it was something along those lines. And so we took these print studios and we didn't use any of the source code and we re-implemented them. One was for 101 Dalmatians, and the other one was for Hercules. And we implemented them ourselves and filled them full of Easter eggs and dog cows and things that we weren't allowed to put in them.
I didn't know that.
Moof.
Yes. If you saved the document with the name Moof ! It replaced all the Dalmatians with Dalmatian cows. So I worked on that stuff, and that was great. It was a small team, and it seemed pretty low-stakes stuff. I mean, I've never written code that prints since then because it was so traumatic. It's just never write printing code because you've got to test it against so many devices. And we found we could, the graphics, we wrote a converter that converted from a Windows format into QuickDraw. And so, because it was vector, basically we were doing sort of vectory things. And we could crash the imaging engine on certain HP printers because we had some slightly malformed code in there, and all sorts of things. Anyway, we did these print studios, and it was great fun. It was probably the most fun that I had on a project at Apple because it was entirely kind of not as a very visible thing. I mean, we needed to hit some dates and get it out there. And working with Disney was an interesting proposition at the time because, we would work towards a GM, and we would send them the GM, and they would say, that's great. We've got a few more things that we need changed. And we're like, no, I think you misunderstand the meaning of the word Golden Master. And that's it.
Yeah.
So I worked on all this stuff. And while this was going on, we were kind of, as a company, we were pretty insulated, or Cork was pretty insulated from the politics of the mothership. We would work on stuff and we'd be given scraps from the table to work on. But on the other side of the planet, things were happening. And Steve came back as a kind of advisor. And then very quickly, Apple bought Next. But it did feel awful like Next bought Apple, because all of the Next people were suddenly in charge of like software and hardware and all this. And there was a massive culture war that went on between the two factions. And the best example of this that I can remember was, by this point, I've skipped forward too much, but I was working on the Finder and the macOS 10 dock at the time because of the work I'd done on DragThing, I think. And I'd always wanted to work on the Finder, and I'd made that abundantly clear to anybody who would listen to me. And there was a meeting when I was over there, because I had to go over fairly frequently, and I was in Cupertino, and there was a meeting, and it was basically the Next people telling the Finder people that they were going to get rid of types and creators, and they were going to move to file name extensions. And one memorable thing is one of the engineers stormed out of the meeting, came back in with beer, and put a beer down in front of the next guy, and then went and sat back down in his seat. And I will always remember that as a sort of just the defining moment of this a clash of the different ways things worked. And I mean, honestly, I think a lot of the decisions have worked out well. Without macOS 10 and without Next and with all that, I don't think we would be in the situation that we're in now.
No,
Sure.
But at the time, it just felt like this alien culture coming in. And, the people I worked with were people who had worked on the Finder since, the classic Finder days. And, the people whose names are in that secret about box. So we didn't really like the Next people at first. But, it all worked out well in the end.
That was a quick jump there.
I mean, like, I say it all worked out well in the end. I mean, not for me, because so what happened with me, I was working on the Finder and the dock, and I didn't design the dock, I should say. There's a whole human interface team that was coming up with the way things worked, and they were prototyping stuff in Macromind Director and products like that. So they would have like a mocked up user interface that sort of worked. And then they would turn around to engineers and they would say, now build this thing. So it was an interesting way of working because, they might not have had the full concept of how things might work. So like, if you're moving a file from one place to the other, that can take an indeterminate amount of time. You could be moving this on the slow network link, or you could be moving it on some fast thing. And so there were details that had to be sort of massaged between the ideal vision of this thing and what actually got built. But so I was working away on this, and Steve Jobs was in talking to the guy, Bas Ording, I can name him, who was the designer of the dock. And Steve was saying to him, and Steve got on well with this guy. There'd been a bidding war, I think, between the Kai's Power Tools people and Apple for this designer. And this guy was, I think at the time, pretty young. I mean, I was extremely young at the time. I was in my early 20s. And Steve said, so how's it going? And Bas goes, it's going really well. The engineer is over from, or the dock engineer is over from Ireland, and, we're making lots of good progress. And Steve goes, interesting. And the story that I then had told to me by people who were in the room is Steve, flanked by, I think it was Avi Tavanian and various other people goes to my boss's boss.
Wow, that's a lot of bosses.
And, effectively backs him up against a wall. And the line that I have heard, and I know that this is 100% what was said, and I apologize for the swearing, is it has come to my attention that the engineer working on the dock is in Ireland. And the macOS 10 user interface was like a massive secret within Apple. When I joined the project, I was told there was only 6 people who had seen it. The implication being that if it leaked, they would know who it was, and
right.
our families would disappear. So I was working on this big secret thing from outside of Cupertino, and Steve was not particularly happy about this. And so I was given an ultimatum to move to California, move to Cupertino, or else. I didn't really want to move to California or the States. I liked being in Europe. I liked being part of Europe. Yes, I did like being part of Europe. He notes. And what happened was I was given this ultimatum, and I said no. And they thought about it for a while, and they said, "Okay, we'll just tell Steve that you moved." And
this is where it gets good.
And I tell this story many times, but it is true that I had an office on the Finder team corridor, and I had my name on the wall, and it was a case of when there was meetings, I would get 24 hours notice to fly over. And,
Jeez.
If there was a demo being done, and I would be on the next plane. And I wasn't allowed to be in the room with Steve in case he said something to me like, how are you finding California? And I would freeze and, become clear or whatever. And it was an extremely stressful time. And this went on for a year. And on my birthday, what happened was macOS 10 was finally unveiled to the public at Macworld in January 2000, I believe, or at least the Aqua user interface was. And I was like, finally, this sort of burden lifted from me that, there were no more secrets. So everything was going to be okay. And a couple of weeks later, I got another ultimatum to move over or else. And the else in this term, at this point, I was told, was I'd be taken off the dock and the Finder team, and I couldn't be guaranteed any interesting work ever again. And that was the quote. And I have to say, I told them what they could do with their job at that point. And I left because this was, it was an extremely stressful time. And also at this time, like I'd been working on Drag Thing at home because I'd got a deal when I joined Apple that I could keep working on pre-existing products, and
that would never happen now. By the way,
no, and as it happened, I found when I left, I found like all the paperwork that I got when I joined, like all the NDAs and stuff like that, and I'd somehow never signed any of them. So
that also would never happen now.
Yes, exactly. But at that time, Drag Thing had become shareware, and people, it was actually doing really well. And I was making more money from that than I was making from my Apple salary.
Wow.
So it was a point of like, it was a really easy thing to leave at that point because I knew I had the safety net. And I moved back to Scotland and moved to the place where I am currently living. And I've been indie ever since. But the thing that was interesting was 3 weeks after I resigned, they fired the entire remaining engineering group, which at that point was 4 people because we had come down from 50 to 4. And what had actually been happening was they were planning to lay everybody off. And of course, I was working on this like high visibility thing, and they didn't particularly want to lay me off. So they gave me an ultimatum, not imagining that I would say no. So they couldn't, if they had come to me and said, we're secretly planning to lay everybody off, so you need to move over, that would have been a different proposition. I'm not sure I'd have gone either. But yeah, it was like an incredibly stressful and interesting time. And like I missed out the whole thing that before that, I was working on some Rhapsody Mac OS X server stuff. And that was an authentication server for this diskless workstation project that wasn't going to go anywhere called Columbus. Alert readers will note that Columbus is in fact the iMac. And I didn't know I was working on the iMac for about a year because we didn't know what an iMac was. And and we were all packed into the Flint Center when the iMac was announced. I still have the T-shirts, or at least some of the T-shirts. And they announced it, and we were like, is that Columbus? Is that our project? No. Especially when he said, and this is going to ship in 90 days. And, it went from because we were working on this, it was a diskless workstation, because diskless workstations were all the rage, things were going to net boot and all this.
They even demoed that with Mac OS X server at some point, right? You could boot a whole classroom of machines off of one server if you wanted to.
Yeah, and that was the plan, and that just didn't happen.
Yeah,
and so Columbus ended up having hard disk in it and not having an at-ease authentication server. So all of my work, it should be pointed out that this is a theme for most of my time at Apple is none of my code ever shipped. So.
It was such an up and down time, right? I mean, I was thinking about when you joined and all of this, just all these projects that went nowhere. And that really was Apple in the 90s, right? You had these OS and projects that didn't go anywhere, these features that didn't go anywhere, that changed vastly. And it's no wonder to me that could be a traumatic place to work in that time.
Yeah, and I think part of it was also because we weren't in California, so we were like even more distant. And so things would happen, be these seismic shifts, and we would just find out when our manager was replaced with somebody else or something happened. And we had like two managers, which is a great thing to have if you're an employee. We had local managers in Cork and we had managers in Cupertino, and they might tell us conflicting things. And also our managers local in Cork didn't have the security clearance to know what we were working on.
What a nightmare. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of your more modern times after this break.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by SaneBox. Go to sanebox.com/MPU and stop drowning in email. SaneBox is an email service that's kind of awesome. It learns what email is important to you and filters out what isn't, saving you hours. Imagine if you hired someone to preview your email for you and just give you the important stuff. That's what SaneBox does. And it works with all kinds of email programs and services, so you don't have to have a specialized application to do it. There are a bunch of ways SaneBox does email filtering. The Sane Later folder keeps your inbox to only what really matters. The Sane Black Hole is like an unsubscription with one click, or you can snooze an email that defers it till the next business day or the weekend or whenever you want. One of my favorite features of SaneBox is Sane Reminders. If you carbon copy or blind copy an email to 1 week or 1 day or 5 hours at sanebox.com and you don't receive a reply in that time, you'll get a reminder. This is a great way to make sure you follow up on email. But SaneBox is more than just filtering. You can move attachments to Dropbox or other cloud services, and they've got various pricing plans starting as low as $4 a month. So get your 14-day free trial today. Go to sanebox.com/MPU and you receive a $25 credit on any plan. I pushed for that $25 credit because I want MPU listeners to try this service. I've been a subscriber for years and I really dig it. That's sanebox.com/MPU and receive that $25 credit on any plan. Thanks, SaneBox, for sponsoring the Mac Power Users. So, James, are you still rocking that Atari 520 STE, or what's your current hardware?
Well, there is an Atari 520 STE sitting, about. I can touch it, but that is not the same one that I owned, I don't think. I mean, who knows? It could have had quite the journey and come back to me like some kind of missing pet. My gear at the moment. So my main machine that I'm speaking to you on now is an iMac Pro. and I would say it's the best Mac I've ever owned, full stop. And it's like a lovely screen. It's fast. It's small. It's silent. And, it would be nice if it had an upgrade in the last couple of years, but, it is a nice machine, and it cost far too much money for what it is. But, I'm not going to do a Syracusa and buy an actual Mac Pro. The other thing that I have sitting next to me is I have a MacBook Pro 13-inch 2020, one of the new ones. I missed out on the entire butterfly era. I came from a 13-inch 2015 machine. So it's nice to have like that 5 years of improvements.
Yeah, I bet. What did you notice first when you went from a 5-year-old Mac to a new one?
I needed lots of adapters and dongles.
Okay, I'll give you that.
No, I think the first thing that I actually noticed was the screen resolution was higher, because I always ran my screen at, not the native resolution, because I wanted just slightly more screen real estate. And I didn't need to do that. And that was the first thing I noticed. I was like, I didn't know that they had, like, in the intervening years, had improved that. The thing is, because I basically came from a clone of my old machine, initially things didn't seem that much different. But it's just, just things are faster, networking is faster. It's more, seems to be more reliable than the Bluetooth stakes, things like that. The battery lasts longer. It doesn't really feel like 5 years of 5 years in iPhones feels like a lot more than 5 years in MacBooks. But
sure.
It's a nice machine, and I miss the fact that the Apple doesn't glow. I think that's my main sadness with it.
It is a bummer. Also, cough, cough, Intel, right? I mean, you're right. We talk about this on the show all the time, how people can run Macs from 2013, 2014, even longer, totally fine. And very often a machine will be dropped from the newest version of Mac OS before it's not usable in terms of specs. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah, I mean, my 2015 machine is going to go to my father as soon as I can actually get his machine and update it. And it's going to be an upgrade for him. And that 2015 machine is a nice machine. One thing I do when I buy my laptops is I spec them to the highest CPUs that I can get, and that gives them that extra year or two of life. I think, just in terms of it's a comparable processor. I mean, I did the benchmarks on the two machines, and because this thing has got 2 more CPU cores, it's a lot faster in multi-core stuff. But is it that much faster in single core stuff? Yes, but not, it's in single core, it's actually faster than my iMac Pro. But, the difference is when you're measuring these things, it's not it's 10 times faster or 5 times faster. It might be twice as fast or something like that.
Yeah. And that's not the first thing you notice. When I asked, would you notice it? You didn't say, oh, it's way faster, because they probably aren't way faster.
Yeah. I mean, it's faster, but there's certainly, the GPU is a lot better and things like that. I mean, it doesn't have the discrete GPU like the 16-inch, which is something I miss. But given how small it is, it already seems to have a tendency to turn the fans on when you stress it. So I don't think they could cram very much more in that old design. I have an iPhone 11 Pro, the small one, and I said about the iMac Pro being the best the best Mac I've had. This is the best iPhone I've had. It's really nice. I alternate between the big ones and the small ones just to have some different experiences, but I love that thing.
Let's talk about that for a second, because a lot of listeners always are torn. Do the small one or the large one. Having used both, what are the big trade-offs in your mind?
I mean, I think there's trade-offs when I keep it in my trousers, do my trousers have a tendency to fall downwards?
Okay.
That is a consideration that I had in mind.
So every other year you wear suspenders. Okay, I got that.
Yeah.
I will point out to UK listeners that suspenders does not mean what you think it means.
Okay. I get in so much trouble with words like that.
but suspenders is like stockings and garters and stuff like that. So anyway.
Then we were talking about the same thing.
Heyo.
But I mean, I like having the larger screen and seeing more. I mean, as I was saying about liking the more screen real estate on the Mac Pro, on the MacBook Pro. And part of it is also my wife hates the big ones. And so every year she gets the hand-me-down from when I get a new phone, she gets that one. So I wanted next year for her to get a small phone. But, it used to be that, you only got the better cameras on the big one, and now everything's pretty much the same apart from the screen size. So there's not as much to choose between them. And I did spend like 45 minutes in an Apple store, like picking them both up and looking at them. And it's like, do I want this one? Do I want this one? Yeah. So I think it's a difficult decision.
Yeah, for me, the Max just was too big. And with this one, I'm back on sort of the smaller size. And the rumors are that all of them are going to get bigger again, which I don't love. But it is nice to have options. For so long, it's like, this is the size iPhone you get, right?
I mean, at least we weren't the people who were sort of clinging to the SE screen size.
Yeah, those people are still sad.
Yes. I've also got an iPad Pro 10.5 inch with a bridge keyboard on it. And, if I'm honest, like the iPad tends to fall in between the phone and the laptop. I don't use it as much. It's mostly a test device when I'm doing development. But when I have the bridge keyboard on it and I have that on it all the time, it's kind of an ultra portable if I'm sort of going out or, going on vacation, if you remember vacations. It's a nice small device that I could take around. Mm-hmm. There was a time that I was running Hackintosh Dell Mini 9, if you remember them, about 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And I hacked that and I took that around Japan when I went on a vacation there for 2 weeks.
Those mini Macs were so popular for a very short period of time, and then you never heard from them again. I think that's something that got wiped out by the iPad.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was also the fact that it became quite hard to do OS updates and things. Yeah. And it was starting to get into an era when security updates were actually really important and things you wanted to install. So you would always be lagging behind and waiting for some people in the Hackintosh community to get those things going. And I've never really thought about going down the Hackintosh route these days, even though I know there are people that do it because Apple doesn't make the perfect machine for them. But yeah, that iPad, I mean, I like it, but I haven't felt the need to upgrade it to the latest models. I mean, I would like them, obviously, but I spent a lot of money on this iMac Pro, and I kind of like the MacBook Pro wasn't cheap either. So it's difficult to justify. Yeah, I mean, it's always like a thing of like, you want to have the latest hardware because you're doing development and you want to be able to support the latest hardware as much as you can. But buying new hardware every year gets really expensive. And, for a lone indie developer, well, I say lone, it's myself and my wife who run the company. But, for just the two of us, spending, many, many thousands per year is difficult. Although this year we're not spending the tens of, at least probably about $10,000 to do the WWDC trip, all told. So that means I can get my shiny new MacBook Pro and still have some money left over.
What do you think about that? What are your thoughts about WWDC becoming a virtual event?
Well, so it's difficult because WWDC is always a very exclusive event. Only 5,000 people get to go to it. And, it's a lottery. It's a sort of somewhat of a loaded lottery, I think, at times. But, there's so many thousand people or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of developers around the world don't get to go to it. But I really liked going to it. And I liked not so much, the sessions are fine, but that's not why you go to WWDC. You can watch those sessions. You can live stream them. They've been live streaming sessions and putting up records of them for years. So that much is not really changing. What I did like about WWDC and what was worth the price of the ticket was going to the labs or talking to engineers who after the WWDC sessions, and especially the sort of the networking and the talking to other people in the community. I mean, that's a huge thing that's going to be missed by me, is like, I don't get to see you guys this year. You know, there's not going to be the relay live recordings of something.
Right.
And, you know, we all hang out, and I'm going to miss that dreadfully. So that's the thing that Apple can't reproduce, you know, no matter what they do. You know, we can talk to each other over microphones like we're doing now, but it's not really the same thing. But as I say, you know, it's the kind of that's in some way a kind of elitist attitude to WWDC. You know, like, I'm sad because I'm not getting to hang out with my friends. But if Apple can improve what they're doing to make the online experience for the vast majority of developers who wouldn't be at WWDC anyway, then that's a big win for everyone. You know, if they can do some kind of, you know, more interactive stuff with people asking questions, or I don't know what they're going to do. And I'm sure Apple are still figuring some of that stuff out. And, you know, I'm extremely curious to see what it's going to be. I mean, it's not like we're going to have, you know, a campus bash, or, you know, a band or any of that stuff. You know, we're not going to have the, you know, students running around trying to collect the most pins. The things that I remember from the last WWDC when I was there, it's all that sort of it's those interactions. And it's also like, it's nice to meet like fellow developers and make these connections with them. And we talk to each other on Twitter all the time, but it's not the same as, I mean, I imagine it's the same for you guys. It's like, you know us like in the developer world, and, you know, we talk to each other, but it's not the same as sort of hanging out. So yeah, I've gone back and forward on that point, but yeah, I think it's going to be a good thing overall for the developer community, because it's going to make things better for the vast majority of people. But I am sad personally for missing out on meeting folk.
Yeah, I've got so much more insight about Apple talking to Apple engineers at bars than I've ever got from a keynote.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many times that I've ended up at some like after party of some event, and you're talking to somebody, and then it turns out, oh, they're on App Store editorial. That's interesting. You know, and there's like, I mean, this is going way back to like 2001, I think. Back then, Apple had an international reception for international developers, and Phil Schiller was there at it. And, you know, I sat and talked to Phil. They stopped doing this like many years ago, but, you know, I talked to Phil for quite a while, and I like explained who I was, you know, and gave him a business card and all that, and it was off the back of that PCalc got bundled with the Anglepoise iMacs. And that was purely because of that interaction that I had, you know, that I got to talk to an Apple VP for like 5-10 minutes, and one who didn't put two and two together that I was a previous Apple employee. But beside that, and it was. The other thing with WWDC is like, also, you know, in recent years, there's all these other events that have sprung up around it. You know, there's WWDC, but it's still worth going out there, even if you don't have a ticket. You know, there's AltConf, there's Layers, there's all these other conferences, and there's all the events. And, you know, I've mentioned the Relay Live things, and, you know, the ATP and all these shows, which are, you know, you think it's good listening to podcasts, even on a live stream. You know, actually being in the room with people, there's just a different energy about it. I think there's going to be a bit of a hole. And my kind of fear is that at some point Apple is going to say, you know what, this worked so much better than actually spending all the time to do the conferences, and, you know, flying 5,000 people and having 2,000 of our engineers meet up from around the world and mix. Maybe that's not a good idea anymore. You know, maybe we should never have conferences again. And I think that's at least a possibility. We don't know exactly where we're going over the next, you know, couple of years in terms of these things. So we could have seen the end of it the end of the old WWDC. But as I say, if it makes it better for the vast majority of other developers and kind of levels the playing field, I think that's a good thing.
Agreed.
So let's talk about PCalc. This is an application you've been working on for how many years now? Is it 92 that you started it?
Yeah, I think it was the summer of 1992. And so PCalc wasn't a calculator originally.
It's called PCalc.
Yeah, okay. So where it came from was I mentioned this user interface class that I did. One of the projects that we had for that was to design a central heating controller, like the kind of thing that would be on your wall, so you can set the temperature, switch programs, that kind of thing. Back in the days before there was like Google connected devices that were running all your heating. And we were doing this in HyperCard. So we had to build this like fake central heating controller in HyperCard and wire everything up and make it work. And because I overdo things all the time, I made this fake 7-segment LCD graphics and these little buttons and things, to make it look as much as I could on a 1-bit Mac screen, look like a real central heating controller. And later on, we had been doing some programming using Think Pascal, as I said, and we started doing some stuff with QuickDraw. Like you could do things in Think Pascal where as soon as you used any QuickDraw commands, it would bring up a window and it would do all the infrastructure behind that. So you could like sort of draw a circle or anything like that. And I realized looking at this stuff that as part of this Think Pascal, we had all the Mac development stuff with it too. So, I could write an actual app. And I thought, I would like to be able to do this. I can write code to a certain extent. So let's see if I can learn how to program a Macintosh. And I was trying to come up with a small project just to start, do for a couple of months to learn how to do it. And the Mac at the time shipped with this very basic calculator, which didn't change until even after the first releases of Mac OS X. It was still this very basic calculator. And we were doing stuff with hex and binary as part of our courses, and I wanted to write a calculator that could do programming stuff as well. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, okay, this is a good thing. I've got this 7-segment LCD font, for a better word, and I've got these button graphics that I've drawn. I could put that together and I could wire up some logic behind it, and I could make a calculator, and that would be a good like sample test project that I would, do once and never think about again. And I worked on that over the summer, and I had, a bunch of my friends as beta testers for it. And I thought, well, it's got to the point where it's pretty usable, and I had people around the world looking at it, and I thought, well, I'll ship it to the world, and it was free, and I uploaded it. I think it was like 23rd of December in 1992, and you can go back and you can look at the Compsys Mac Digest for a post on the 23rd of December, and you'll see my original PCalc post. And the thing was that I didn't work on it again for a while, and I went on and I worked on DragThing. But PCalc was this small piece of code, and whenever I was trying to learn something new, it was a good test project. So like when I was learning about Code Warrior's Power Plant user interface framework, which is kind of like the sort of app kit of the day. So you could build the interface in a graphical environment and then wire it up. And anyway, so I rebuilt PCalc in that, and that was PCalc 2.0. PCalc 3.0 was me learning about the HI toolbox, which was the more modern Mac APIs that came along after that. And when it came time for the iPhone, it was like, well, this is another good test project. I'll make a version of PCalc. I'll port it over to the iPhone, because I had a very portable version of the brain of PCalc, which I'd written for the dashboard widget version of PCalc back in for whenever Dashboard came along.
Yeah, Tiger maybe.
Yeah, somewhere.
Yes, Tiger. I'm looking at your history page. Yeah, Tiger.
Thank you for doing the research. So I had this code that wasn't really connected to the rest of the Mac APIs, and it was more just a brain that I could drop in. And I ported that to the Mac within, like half an hour ported that to the iPhone SDK in like half an hour. And then it was a case of like, can I wire up some buttons, like put a button on the screen, put two buttons on the screen, put a text field up and see if I can push the button, send a message down to the engine, get a response back, display that on the screen. I was like, yeah, this works. So I could build a calculator. And so I got PCalc running for the day one of the App Store. And for day one of the App Store, there were 400 apps. And I think PCalc was the only calculator. And it did remarkably well, way more than I was expecting. And it was making like actual money, and way more money than DragThing was making by this point, because DragThing had kind of tailed off. And so my efforts kind of went into the iOS version a lot, because I was, I've got to make the money to eat. So, it's like,
sure.
People are buying this, so I'm going to spend my time there. And it was kind of like, as DragThing was on the way down, PCalc, particularly on the iPhone, was on the way up. And at some point I realized that I was, the iOS version was like the lead platform and the Mac version was kind of the port. And it actually came the PCalc 4. So I learned UIKit before I learned AppKit, because I was like a classic Mac OS toolbox person. And AppKit was like, as I discussed, was the next. It was the enemy. It was the... and like the Finder was written using PowerPlant. It wasn't written using AppKit. And it was supposed to be a kind of... That was the... Part of the thinking was to demonstrate Apple's commitment to carbon. Well, look what happened there. But anyway, so I didn't know AppKit, but I wanted to do a modern version of PCalc on the Mac. And I took the iOS code and I ported the iOS code to the Mac. And this is years before Catalyst. So the current Mac version is actually the iOS code. And it's the iOS code frozen in a moment in time, which is why it doesn't have some of the features from the iOS version, like layout editing. And I'm keeping it up to date, and I'm not, it's not like languishing, but it's just interesting that like the iOS code is now everywhere. Mm-hmm. And actually, if you look at it, it's the dashboard widget code is now everywhere.
So you over the years have developed a little bit of a reputation for adopting things early. So I'm just going to run through a list here. You had a widget in iOS 8 that included a calculator. Apple then asked you to remove it, and it kind of blew up into this whole thing, which was like back and forth for a while. You, of course, are on the Apple Watch, but also the Apple TV. You have a tvOS version that you can control with a game controller because reasons. And then, of course, there's this delightful, as Mac Stories calls it, a delightfully insane about screen, where you took a bunch of stuff about ARKit and Metal and all these technologies really designed for things that aren't calculators and slammed them into your calculator app. And I wonder what's the thinking behind doing these extra things in the app that seem to be not necessary for a calculator, but definitely make the app more fun.
So I talked about PCalc as being a thing that I used to learn. And that's always true. And one of the things that was clear a few years ago was that Apple was looking into AR stuff. And they were investing more heavily into AR than seemed to be justified for what they were doing with AR. So, the smart money was on Apple possibly working on some kind of AR hardware down the line. And that's a rumor that persists. I mean, we know it's more than a rumor, but what ships, who knows? But so I was like, this could be the next sort of iPhone in terms of impact, and I would like to learn about this stuff. So I'd done some 3D programming back in my computing science days, working on Sun workstations with RenderMan and things like that. But I hadn't done any 3D stuff since then. I was like, okay, so Apple has a 3D library SceneKit, and they have ARKit, which is built on top of SceneKit and can work with other 3D engines. But, that's what Apple is using for stuff. So should be something that I should look into. And I just started messing around with 3D code. And, I started, and it's like, I was basically working my way through all the APIs in SceneKit. And you work down and it's like, oh, there's a physics engine. That's interesting. So I can create 3D objects and then assign, mass to them, and, they will, there's gravity and they will fall and they will behave realistically. And it's like, well, let's experiment with that. And that was where I ended up with the logo for the icon for PCalc, and you could throw bananas at it or whatever. And I worked my way further down the list of things, and it's like, oh, there's a vehicle API. Well, that seems interesting. Let's try putting a little vehicle in. And, I made a little car that you could drive around. And as I said before, I'd always wanted to write games, and I'd never really succeeded in any writing of games. But I took this car, and I could drive this car around on a little flat plane. And I made a sort of triangular ramp. It was a very simple 3D object that I made in Blender, and I put it into the environment, and I gave it a physics object associated with it. And I drove my car at that ramp, and the car jumped into the air and did this sort of slow motion, 80s TV show jump, and then landed. And I was like, this is the coolest thing I have ever written. And that kind of spiraled from there. Part of the background to this is also, I have something of an obsession about secret about boxes and about screens. And I would direct people to a talk that I did at NS North and at
Swift Live?
Swift Live, Hacking with Swift Live. Yeah. That's it. Sorry, Paul, I do remember. So part of my obsession about boxes is I always wanted to be in the Finder secret about box ever since I first found it in 1991. And I wrote the macOS 10 Finder secret about box, and I put my own name in it, added my name to that list of scrolling credits that goes back to the Lisa. And the next week, I checked the code in, and the next week, Steve ordered all credits to be removed from the operating system. And that
you were there for a week.
And it shipped out in one build internally, and that was it. I had success in my grasp, and then it was taken away. So I always had that. I'm going to make a secret about box. I'm going to put my own name in it, and it's going to be the best secret about box.
Take that Steve Jobs, is what you're saying.
Yes. That was... Spite is something that powers me through many things. The other thing is, if you look at the timing, I was working... I was learning a lot from this, and it's been interesting work, and it has paid off in various ways. But this was also 1996 that I was working on this stuff, and shall we say the political landscape in both the UK and the US was shifting dramatically around about 96, and I needed an outlet that I could put my creativity into, and I could, as a effectively a mental health thing. And so this was not a great time, but I could concentrate on this thing, and I could make this thing, and nobody was telling me that I couldn't make this thing. So I was doing it, and it was a nicely sort of interactive thing, because I was posting videos as I was doing things, and I had I added game center support and leaderboards and things, and challenges, and one Mike Hurley was the reigning champion for the first level of the game, to the point where I sent him a physical trophy, and it was a nice little escape, and it was a thing that I did, and one of the things that was a kind of a spin-off of that was I'd learned all this 3D code, and I did my Dice by PCalc app, which is my Dungeons and Dragons dice rolling app. And that was, I gave myself a challenge because as people might know, I've not done many apps in my career, like of the stuff that actually shipped, leaving aside all the Apple stuff that didn't. There's like PCalc and DragThing are the two main things that actually shipped. So I gave myself a challenge, which was to write a new app in a week from pressing new project in Xcode to shipping it on the App Store.
James, I just have one question. I mean,
yeah.
For us old folk, how come there isn't a text adventure in your About box?
Well, it's funny that you say that because there is.
There is?
So it's not shipped. So the About screen has level 1, which is the driving the car around a little small enclosed bit with jumping the car through hoops and stuff. Then there's a golden banana at the side of it's a fairly featureless box. And if you drive at the golden banana, you hit the wall and you actually break through the wall like the scene in Tron where the light cycles escape the grid, which was entirely my inspiration. And the bricks go flying, and you're on a bridge, and it takes you to a small city, which you can drive around in. There's a helicopter. There's a whole bunch of stuff. What? You can fly the helicopter. And beyond that, there's a tunnel right at the edge of the world. There's a small tunnel, and above it, there was a sign that said level 3 ? And you drive into that, and in a version which has never shipped, you drove into that, and then it would start a text adventure where basically you would transition from, the thing, and then it would say, you're in a tunnel, you're standing next to a car, blah, blah, blah. There's a golden banana next to you. And then it took you into this thing. And I prototyped it out to sort of 4 or 5 rooms that you could walk through. The problem was I was using, there's a text adventure creation tool, a modern one called Inform. I think it's Inform. I'll double check that. But to get you could build a text adventure that basically could run in a web view, and that was fine. But I couldn't get what I wanted was be able to affect state from one to the other. So you could go into this text adventure, you could change things, and then you'd come back out to the 3D world and stuff would have changed. And I never figured out a good way of doing that. And then it was pointed out to me that perhaps I was spending a little bit too much time working on this thing and not actually working on my product. I will not say who pointed this out. But so I decided to mothball that for some future thing. But one day
you must ship it. You must ship it. That's all I'm going to say.
A lot of people know about it now that you've said it, so you got to do it.
I will one day perhaps ship it. I wrote some good copy for the text in that, and I was quite happy with it. But yes, we'll see one day. Mm-hmm. But the spin-off of that was I had all the 3D knowledge, and I challenged myself to do this new project from scratch. And in fact, it was one Jason Snell who challenged me to do it. He may not have said, and then spend best part of the next 10 months working on it as well. But anyway, so because I was doing Total Party Kill, the UK variant at the time, I was trying to get it ready for that when we were doing that. And it's I shipped it within 2 weeks, which for an engineering estimate is pretty good. And it's now become my new About screen, and it's the thing that I tinker with. If I'm needing an escape, I can come up with a new set of dice, or add some silly feature to it or whatever. But the difference between it and the About screen is that it actually sells for money and people buy it. So it probably is not financially a wise investment. I mean, that's one of the reasons I added a tip jar to it in the version that came out last week. But it's, it's at least making some money, and I have somewhere to put some creative energies that are not strictly calculator related.
I just love that, you put all this effort into the About box, but PCalc is also just a remarkable calculator. And Apple, for whatever reason, doesn't spend the effort and time that you have building a calculator for their devices. So it's great that you were there in day one, but you've always really been, if not one of the best calculators available for iPhone and iPad.
I think there are other calculators, and they all have strengths and they all have different weaknesses. And, PCalc works very well as a kind of an old school calculator, the kind of thing that people would have paid hundreds of dollars for 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And there seems to be a place for that still. And I'm very glad that there is. And I like using it as a way, like we were talking, I did an Apple Watch version of it. And like the Apple Watch is an interesting thing to program for because it's a constrained environment. And that's a fun thing, is like trying to make something run, where you don't have infinite amounts of memory or processor speed or GPU power or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And that, like I got part of the PCalc About screen running inside Siri. So that was, there's things like that. I like those challenges. And, the original iPhone was also that kind of a challenge, was like, if you're writing something on an iMac Pro, you can pretty much write anything. And even if your code is not great, it will run. But if you're working on a especially an original Apple Watch and you're trying to get stuff running, it challenges you to do things. And I think that's what I like. I like the challenge.
Well, I think it pays off because PCalc, like David said, it not only is an incredible calculator, but you have created a fan base for an app that really shouldn't have one. Like, no offense, but like
none taken at all.
Calculators are tools, but you've created PCalc. You've given it this personality that people resonate with, right? I mean, the fact that you put leaderboards in there, people were racing each other. And, I was so angry that I couldn't catch up with Mike on the racing. Like all of that stuff, I think it goes to build the brand around PCalc. And I think it's phenomenal. I think a lot of developers could learn from your experimentation and your sort of sidetracks into these different things.
I've been very lucky. I think there's a certain amount of effort, yes, but I think there's also been a lot of luck and being in the right place at the right time. Because if I was coming to the App Store now, today, I don't know that I could have that same impact. And in some ways, it's actually quite scary to hear people say, lots of, developers look up to you or something. And it's like, wow, okay, now this is pressure, because like, if people say, how do I do what you do? And it's like, I don't know. I've kind of just lucked into a lot of things. The basic things of trying to put your personality into something, I think, is useful. And I mean, like, it's very hard to get noticed on the App Store. Like there were 400 apps, and there's now, somewhere between 2 and 3 million, maybe more than that. So by doing the stuff with like silly things with about screens, or selling T-shirts, or whatever my craziness of the season is, that actually helps in terms of, people might not use my product, but they might have heard of me. Mm-hmm. And, maybe the next time if they're thinking about buying something, they will have heard somebody talk about PCalc, or, I tend to turn up in strange places, and, it's like the stuff with the Hackett number we were doing on Connected, which mm-hmm. was, just a bit of silliness. But I mean, that was Kate in the chat room suggesting that it go into PCalc. But, I have form for doing that kind of thing, like adding the thing for Mike. And I think it's partially imposter syndrome, but there is that kind of, am I more than just the gimmicks? Am I more than the silliness? And I think I am. But then the little voice at the back of my head says, nah, the only reason people have heard of you is because, you're flinging virtual bananas around in a 3D environment or whatever. I don't know, but yeah, it's. I think the basic idea of having a little bit of whimsy inside software and having your personality come through in software is definitely. It's a lesson. Like I talked about Jeff Minter, the games developer, and his games. You can recognize one of his games. Even from the Commodore 64 to a PlayStation 4, you look at it, it's him that's written it. And that kind of thing, I think it is something that a lot of software doesn't have. Stuff can be very sort of similar.
Yeah. I think you're too hard on yourself, James. You made a really great app and you're having fun with it too. There's nothing wrong with that.
Given that I've been doing this for 20 years officially actually more than that, because like my company was founded in 97, but I've been doing this full time for 20 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I must be doing something right.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is still a voice that says, nah, this is the year that you're going to be found out.
Yeah, I get that. I get that.
This episode of Mac Power Users is brought to you by OneBlocker. We all know that trackers and annoying pop-ups are a big problem on a whole bunch of websites. To take back control over your privacy and to get a better browsing experience, you need OneBlocker. It is a Safari content blocker for both macOS and iOS. It's secure, easy to use, and efficient at blocking stuff you don't want to see. OneBlocker comes with a curated built-in filter set containing over 160,000 rules. It lets you block things like intrusive ads, trackers, and other annoying elements on sites, such as cookie notices, comments, social network share buttons, adult sites, and more. And it's not just about blocking ads. OneBlocker can serve as a parental control or productivity tool. It's easy to use. You just flip a couple of switches, and you're all set. The app will automatically receive cloud updates to the built-in filter silently, so you don't have to do anything to keep it up to date. You just set it and forget it. It's a fully native app designed to extend Safari naturally, so it doesn't drain your battery by taking up your device's resources. I've used OneBlocker since it first came out. I have it on all of my Apple devices, and I really don't want to browse the web without it. It's available on Mac and iOS, so if you want to protect yourself from online ads and trackers, get websites open faster, and improve your browsing experience, head to oneblocker.com or search OneBlocker. That's the digit 1 blocker, all one word, in the App Store. Our thanks to OneBlocker for their support of MPU. You just touched on it before the break, but one thing that always really makes me respect PCalc and your work is the longevity. I was just thinking as we were preparing the different transitions you've had to go through with PCalc, right? Multiple processor changes, classic macOS to OS X, the iPhone, app stores, the iPad, Catalyst, all of this stuff. And I wonder how you approach these changes as they are on their horizon, how you think about them, and what are some of your goals when Apple throws everyone a curveball?
I mean, there was quite a while where Apple would stand up at WWDC and say, this is the future. And then the next year, it wasn't the future.
Sure.
We had Copeland that we talked about. There was things like QuickDraw GX. There was OpenDoc. There was Dylan, which was a programming language that Apple came up with. And so there are things like that where, I have a bit of a memory, like the little devil on my shoulder that says, don't listen to this, it's a trick. But there's a lot of stuff where you can see where Apple is going. And it's, a lot of this stuff, it's like you have to jump on board. When Apple is changing processor or Apple is bringing out a completely new device or doing all these things or moving to the App Store, like it's been pretty clear since at least the last 20 years that when Apple does something, follow it. Some of the stuff has been easier than others. Like the move to from 68K to PowerPC was quite a big transition in my brain, but PowerPC to Intel was not really that hard at all. And I would expect Intel to ARM is going to be like literally zero work for me, because most of my code already works on ARM. Like all the low level stuff that would be the kind of stuff that's generally run into processor levels of problems. All that code is common between the iOS and the Mac version at this point. So, it already runs. There's not going to be a problem. So technology changes are less problematic than the business model changes, really. The App Store was like a seismic thing across software. I think changed the entire software industry completely. Back in the day, like PCalc, like DragThing was $30 and PCalc was $20. And when the App Store was coming, like the iOS App Store, it was pretty clear that like $20 was going to be quite a lot. So I swallowed my pride and I halved the price, and I made PCalc $10. And I thought, well, this is practically giving the software away. And now we're at the other, however many years later, and $10 is like the premium level, pricing and free within app purchase, or maybe subscriptions, or whatever. People have tried many different monetization paths across the last decade, and it's really hard to come up with a thing. I'm still selling PCalc at $10, and that's seen as some kind of freak of pricing these days. It's done well for us, and like I'm not going to change that, and I will ride that as long as I can, because that's it's paying for paying our bills at this point, almost 100%. But yeah, that stuff, the business stuff. I mean, remember, software used to ship in boxes, and like there would be sections in an Apple store. Apple stores don't seem that recent a thing, they do seem like a recent thing, Apple stores. But there was a time when they had multiple shelves worth of box software that people would buy, and that's all gone. And the App Store is entirely responsible for that.
Yeah, it does seem like the industry has really been turned on its head throughout your career, but you've managed to keep it going, and all with the calculator app. That, to me, that's the part that's so impressive. You talked about transitions. Do you think? I mean, there's a lot of speculation that we're going to get an ARM Mac and an ARM processor-based Mac here, maybe next month, but or at least an announcement of one next month, but maybe in a year. Having gone through so many transitions in the past, what are your thoughts about that?
It doesn't frighten me at all. I think, like, back in the day when we were having processor transitions, like even the PowerPC to Intel transition, there was a lot more code that would be more low-level, sort of hand-tuned assembly type stuff. And now, even with games and stuff, things are written more high-level. So it's easier to port things. There's less architecture-specific stuff. I mean, there's still going to be some software which is like that. Anything that's very performance-heavy, you can see that kind of thing. But nowadays stuff runs on GPUs, and there's not so much of the hand-tuned assembly doing things. So I don't think you're going to notice. Like, for the average person on the street, what they might notice is if Apple doesn't ship some kind of Intel emulator on the devices, and they just don't have the software, because that's going to be a problem. Because Apple, they did the 68K emulator, and they did the PowerPC emulator. So they've got form for doing that kind of thing and allowing old software to work. And if they do that, nobody's going to notice. It's going to take a while for things like Photoshop to appear. I mean, what will happen is Photoshop will be demoed on the, when they do the keynote, they announce it, they'll say, and here we have so-and-so from Adobe who's going to show off Photoshop. We gave them access to the SDK 3 days ago, and they've already got it running. Yeah. That is that kind of story that you'll see. And then Photoshop will actually ship a year later. But I think for developers like me, it's not going to be a problem. And I don't see, I've seen so many processor transitions. I don't have a particular allegiance to any kind of any architecture. It's been nice having Intel because you can run Windows and you can have things like that. So you can have an overlap with PCs. And I think for games that's still going to be important. But if your main gaming machine is a Mac, then you're already having problems getting games these days. So I suspect, yes, if I had to guess, I would say for most apps, you're not going to notice the difference. You're going to get fewer games, probably, or fewer big games. And it's going to inconvenience a very small amount of people who run virtual machines, and Apple is not going to care.
Mm-hmm.
What about like legacy software? You always lose some software whenever you make this transition. Do you think it's going to be a big hit to software developers, or is this something where it's going to be fairly simple to get transitioned over? I guess you've already answered that.
I think like the 64-bit or the loss of 32-bit is probably going to be a bigger hit.
Sure.
Because anything that survived the 32-bit apocalypse is
that makes sense.
Probably has had some work done to it and is in a reasonable state that it can be recompiled for new systems. Stuff that, it's rare. I mean, it's not impossible. I've got some apps that are, 64-bit, but are still, like haven't been updated in 6 or 7 years or something like that. And I expect that if Apple does do some kind of emulation, they'll continue to work just fine. The processors will get faster and the emulators will work. And then it's not going to be when the machines come out. It's going to be like 4 or 5 years down the line when Apple says, right, we're going to stop doing this backward compatibility environment. And that's when stuff will die. I mean, it's possible that Apple will turn around and will say, we're not doing that, and developers just need to support it. And, anything that's submitted to the App Store has to be compiled for both. But if I had to put money on it, I would say that they won't do it that way.
I liked what you said about having gone through several of these transitions. I remember when Intel was rumored, people were like, oh, it's not going to feel like a Mac. And I always thought that was silly. It's like, yeah, it's going to feel way better because it's going to be way faster. And
yeah,
they've got to prove that this time, right? Especially on the high end, like your iMac Pro and my Mac Pro. But I think especially in the portable world, which are the vast majority of Macs sold anyways, it's going to be nice because you're going to have machines that hopefully run longer, better battery life. They run cooler. And I think there's going to be a lot of good from this transition.
I remember being excited by the Intel transition as well. I mean, we got the developer transition kit machines, which were basically a G5 case. And if you opened it up, there was this tiny little circuit board in it, which was the entire Intel PC.
Yeah. I wrote a thing on Mac Stories about that. I'll put it in the show notes. If you haven't seen this thing, it is bananas.
The first thing I did with that machine when it arrived was I installed Windows and I played Half-Life 2 on it.
Okay.
But we had that machine for a long time, and then Apple wanted them back because it was just a loan. And then they very nicely sent all the developers who had one the first Intel iMacs as a freebie, and that was great. And my mother was using that machine until fairly recently. And it would be nice if we get a developer transition machine, but there's been lots of speculation whether we just install something onto an iPad. If you've got an iPad Pro with a trackpad and a keyboard, and maybe that's something that Apple can just say, download this firmware update, this software, and hey presto, you've got an ARM Mac, and they don't need to ship hardware out to people.
If that happens, people are going to go nuts because everybody's going to want to, or some people are going to want to turn their iPads into Macs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would love if it was something that could dual boot, or you run like a little macOS app inside the iOS or something like that. I mean, who knows? The thing, like we're talking about transitions. It's like when I was at Apple in this must have been like sort of 98 or something. I saw macOS 10 running on Intel. in some engineer's office who was like, their job was to make sure that everything built for multiple processors and, just keep the builds running. And we had to fix bugs in the Finder because, we would have some problem on an Intel machine. And that was in 98, and they didn't ship until, was it 2006? Something like that?
Yeah, January 07 was the... Wait, no. Yeah, 06, January 06, because it was the MacBook Pro and the iMac, a year before the iPhone was announced.
So you've got like 8 years that in the labs, macOS was running on this processor architecture. That, is inconceivable to imagine that macOS 10 hasn't been running on ARM for like 4 or 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
Probably way longer.
Yeah, Apple likes to have those backup plans well understood before they need them.
Yeah, exactly. And even at the point where they started doing their own ARM chips, there are very clever people inside Apple who are working out all these strategies, and are like, well, let's just keep this one in our back pocket. Also, it's a good leverage factor on Intel and things like that. So, yeah, I think they could do a drop an ARM version, day one of WWDC. I think that's entirely possible, but maybe it's next year. Maybe, who knows what plans have been thrown into chaos over the last 3 months or whatever. And I guess we're going to find out in a month, less than a month.
Mm-hmm.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by DevonThink. Get organized and unleash your creativity. Use the link in our show notes for 10% off. We talk about DevonThink a lot on the show. It's the flagship product from Devon Technologies. DevonThink is a professional document and information management application for the Mac, and it helps you collect, file, organize, edit, and annotate all kinds of documents so you can reach digital organizational heaven. With DevonThink, you can archive all your emails with the enhanced email archiver and scan your paper documents with the revised scanner interface. You can even imprint PDFs with custom stamps and watermarks before giving them to others. Then organize your documents in any way you want. There are smart groups that let you create different views of your data, integrated artificial intelligence to assist you with filing and searching, create smart rules, and add flexible reminders to any document. The DevonThink automation tools are really powerful, and even non-programmers can easily automate many parts of the workflow, so you can delegate the boring, repeating tasks to DevonThink. And finally, sync your data securely between your devices, using your preferred web storage or even directly on the local network. And then you can take your data with you with DevonThink's iOS companion app, DevonThink to Go. Now you can get 10% off DevonThink 3 or upgrade to it right now. Just go to devontechnologies.com/MPU. That's devontechnologies.com/MPU for 10% off. Our thanks to Devon Technologies for their support of this show and all of Relay FM. So, James, having been on the Mac since the beginning, why don't you tell us some of your favorite apps and services that you use?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the apps that I've used almost as long as I've used a Mac is BBEdit. BBEdit is I think you could call it a veteran text editor that's been around since before I was programming. Rich Siegel, who I'm somehow friends with, who's one of the main writers of BBEdit, he worked on Think Pascal, which was the first development environment I used. And I use BBEdit for basically stunt text editing. Anytime I have to do some very complicated search and replace across multiple files and multiple things, I always go for BBEdit. Photoshop, I've used that for a similar time frame. I mean, it's been around, I think, at least early 90s as well. And I use that for UI design and doing all the graphics. Now I use Illustrator a lot as well for doing vector stuff.
So that's where we got the golden banana, is what you're telling me.
Well, the golden banana was actually rendered inside SceneKit. But anyway, Xcode, people complain a lot about Xcode, but I really like it. It does a lot of stuff. I mean, it's got a full 3D editor in it. It's got tons of stuff. And, it has problems, and it's sometimes more stable than other times because, it's in constant evolution. But, it's the app that I spend most of my time in. Blender is an app that I've used for doing any of the 3D modeling stuff. It's a free app, and the user interface is not particularly Mac-like, and it's changed dramatically recently. But it's free, and there's a lot of tutorials and things out there if you're looking to get into 3D stuff. I talked about emulation, and Basilisk 2 and Sheepshaver are two apps that I've used for emulating 68K and PowerPC Max. I talked about that I've done these talks, and it's useful to be able to go back and see what my environment was like, 20, 30 years ago. And I've got actually full development environment set up, so I can build, like PCalc 1.0 and 2.0 from source currently. And it's good you can go back and you can run all this old code, see what things were like, and take videos for talks. Useful for historical stuff, as Stephen, I'm sure, will appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
VMware Fusion is useful for emulating more recent systems if you want to have like an old version of macOS running on a modern system or a PC. And the other thing that I use a lot, Logic Pro X for audio editing and music stuff. I said I had all these synthesizers and, sadly sold them off, but, you don't need hardware synthesizers anymore. You can even get emulators inside Logic for emulating things like my old Juno 106. And yeah, that's the sort of big stuff that I use.
There's even a lot of emulators on iPad. I don't know if you've played with any of those.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's like, besides reading comics and watching videos and things, one of the main things that I've spent money on the iPad is spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars on music apps because, yeah, you get Korg and people like that have done a lot of really nice apps, and you can plug them into full-size keyboards and things, and it's like, yeah, all these thousands of dollars worth of synthesizers can be reproduced by a small iPad or a phone.
I know, it's crazy. and they even like mirror the logic of them, like you can make connections, and it is just crazy. I mean, the things that I used to drool in the music store over that were way beyond my budget are now like $5 on the iPad.
Yeah, you can get like the Fairlight sampler synthesizers, which, if you've ever listened to something like Art of Noise or those bands from the 80s, you can get virtual versions of those synthesizers with those sounds and play around with them. It's great fun.
But you're not just into Apple hardware, are you?
So I wrote this down. I added a section into our show notes, which was my favorite piece of non-Apple hardware. And currently, this is a thing called the Mister. And the Mister is an open source FPGA-based hardware emulation of old consoles and computers. And to break that down, it's basically an FPGA is a processor which you can, in hardware, tell it to be another processor or a group of processors or things. So you can take what would be the design schematic for a processor effectively and load it into this thing and say, you're now a 68,000 processor, or you're now this. And so what people have done is they've taken this reference platform, which is a thing a bit like a Raspberry Pi, but it has an FPGA on it, and it's not horrendously expensive. It's like $100 and something. And then they've built all these boards that connect to it, and they have created this thing which can run like it can be a Super Nintendo, or it can be an Apple II, or it can be a Macintosh, or it can be a Commodore 64. It can be any of these things connected to your television, and you can get boards that will add USB ports, so you can plug in a keyboard and mouse, or you can have HDMI out, or you can have a board that does VGA or analog out, or you can have things that let you plug in game controllers from, like a Super Nintendo controller directly into it. I don't want to say, it's a perfect recreation, because it's still at some level it's emulation, but it's emulation done in a different way. And, you can build, if you're trying to simulate, say, like a Super Nintendo, you can have, well, here's the sound chip, here's the CPU, here's this thing. and we'll plug them together, and they will work much closer to the real thing than the software emulators that you might come across, and a much more better performance and much more accurate to like back in the days of like Commodore 64 things, where you would get these amazing demo programs that were written by way smarter programmers than me, that everything was down to this individual cycle of the CPU, all the timings and things to make it work. And that's where this kind of emulation really pays off. It will do a wide range of things, mostly sort of 8-bit and 16-bit era consoles and computers. But it's got a really fascinating sort of homebrew scene around it. And, you start the thing up and download the latest cores that have been developed by people, and somebody's like added support for, there's now a TurboGrafx 16 CD drives and things like that. And it's a very hobbyist thing, and you're sourcing all these boards from around the world and RAM chips of a certain caliber, and you're putting it together and hoping it works. And for somebody who like generally buys a Macintosh and like it comes sealed and I don't really touch what's inside it, it's quite nice to actually put something together at a hardware level. And you can do it at the level of actually make the boards themselves, because they're all the schematics are released for things, so you can go in at whatever level you want, and it's worth it, and explore and play with if you're into sort of playing with old computers and seeing how they worked.
There is something satisfying about getting your hands on the hardware. We started the show and I talked about how I doubled the RAM in my Atari by opening up and soldering on RAM chips. I don't think you'd do that with your iMac Pro.
Mm-mm.
No.
Please don't.
I think
Steven might. I don't know.
You could take that thing apart, but yeah, most people shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, most stories I hear of people we know taking things apart, they generally end badly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like modern Macs, you open them up and there's like a popping sound, like it just unwound a spring and you were never going to rewind it.
I think it's like cars. I think there's a certain amount of, cars these days. I'm not one of those car people, but I get the impression that, a modern car is more like an iPhone than it is like an old Mac.
Yeah. Well, James, we love PCalc. We're both users of it. It's on my home screen, so that's a big testament.
Very nice to hear.
And I love the 42 in the icon as someone who grew up on, reading Douglas Adams. And in fact, you have a story about him too. We're going to save that for the next time you're on the show. But thank you so much for bringing PCalc to us, and all the goofy stuff you do is really fun. And I do like seeing that, but I also just love that you've made such a solid app.
Well, thank you. And, it's very nice to be on here and, to get the respect that I'm finally deserve,
Yes,
deserve,
exactly.
and all that.
Exactly. Gang, if you want to find James, where should people go?
So if you want to talk to me, Twitter is sadly the best way. I'm James Thomson on Twitter. That's Thomson without a P. If you want to find out about PCalc or any of that stuff, pcalc.com. This is the advantage of starting so early, is that I can have, like a 5-character domain name. But also tla.systems is our company thing. But yeah, find me on Twitter. That's generally the easiest way.
Yeah, and check out in the App Store, PCalc. It's in basically every app store, Mac App Store, iPhone App Store, Apple TV App Store. We didn't talk about that. You made an Apple TV calculator, but just go with us there. And also, I forget what's the name of the dice game again.
It's Dice by PCalc, because
Dice by PCalc.
I was trying to come up with a name that hadn't been taken and there weren't any, so I just did the Apple way and added my brand onto the name, and there you go.
Hey, it works. Totally works.
There's something about the 4-sided dice. I can't stop rolling it. I had the same problem when I was a kid, and I had a physical 4-sided dice. It's just a fascinating bit of engineering there. But Anyway, go check that out. And the Photos Field Guide, gang, the introductory price is going away very shortly after the show publishes. If you want to get that, head over to learn.maxsparky.com. And thanks to our sponsors, and that's our friends over at SaneBox, OneBlocker, and Devon Technologies. And we'll see you next week.